Hi, this is Ken Fenyo, and welcome to this episode of the Retail Playbook, where I discuss with retail leaders on growth, innovation, and loyalty. And today I'm excited to have as my guest Grant Steadman, who is my partner in Asterworks, a boutique firm working on AI transformation. And Grant has a long and exciting career in retail and retail insights that I'm looking forward to talking about as we get into today's session. Welcome, Grant.
Thanks, Ken. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Well, why don't we start off? Why don't you give us your background, since I'm sure I just did a horrible job giving it justice. But why don't we hear more from you of a bit on what you've done in your.
Yeah, surely. Grant Steadman. I'm a consultant advisor to retailers and retail technology companies. I specialize in data-driven marketing, loyalty, personalization, retail media, merchandising, and increasingly artificial intelligence. Been in the business over 20 years. I spent a lot of my career at dunnhumby. I was there for almost 17 years, running different businesses in different parts of the world for them. And coming to you today from Austin, Texas, where I've been based since 2017.
Excellent. Yeah, sort of San Francisco East, as I think after the COVID, everyone fled there. So let's talk a bit about dunnhumby. So we both have experience at dunnhumby. You actually working there. When I was at Kroger, I helped did a lot of work with dunnhumby, which at the time was dunnhumby USA, is now 8451 as part of Kroger. But tell me a little bit about some of the stuff you did there. I think it's a really interesting business, and I always gave dunnhumby a ton of credit for being such a pioneer in using customer data for both marketing reasons, but even just really running all aspects of the business. So be curious to hear a bit more about how did you get involved with them, and then a little bit of some of your different experiences.
Yeah. So I started my career on the agency side. So I was at different above the line and then direct marketing, very early days of digital marketing, and a little bit in retail media, working with some brands and retailers. Shopper marketing was most of that work at that time. And my joke is that I was always asking annoying questions about, is this actually working? Is anyone buying anything? Are we selling anymore? And so I heard of dunnhumby. I had Unilever was a customer of mine at the agency I was at. And they actually had mentioned dunnhumby to me and said, they're doing this pioneering work with Tesco. This was, early 2000s, very early 2000s. They're doing this pioneering work with Tesco. They can answer some of these questions that you keep annoying us with. So I went to work there almost exactly 20 years ago in their retail media, shopper marketing, comms and media team. Worked a little bit with Tesco, and then in what they call their consumer markets division, so non-grocery, non-retail customers, convenience, energy, banking. So I worked in that team for a while. And then I was asked to go to the Nordics and lead their Nordic expansion. So I lived in Oslo, Norway for 7 years, and I was CEO of their Norway joint venture, and then across the Nordic region with Denmark and Finland as well. And then I came here to the US 2017 and led a division of clients, and then was president of their North America business for 3 years. So yeah, know the company pretty well. Really unique. Interesting place, and started as real pioneers in loyalty and using first-party customer data, and then really built out and expanded from that into a global data company working with retailers and brands across all kinds of aspects of merchandising, category collaboration, personalization, marketing, retail media. So branched into some interesting niches, and it was a fantastic experience, and lots of good times working.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a great company, and I really always thought that it was one of the big drivers, and I think it still is a big driver of Kroger's success. And I think they were able to really steal a march on a lot of the industry by trying to take advantage of all the customer data they were capturing, but weren't doing all that much with. And so I don't think people really understand how broad the data was used. So you mentioned comms. I think Kroger and obviously all the dunnhumby clients were really early on personalized marketing, meaning, hey, if I know you buy Tide and I know you buy Cheerios and I know you buy Coke, I can create a set of offers for you that are highly relevant and really motivate you to come back in the store. And those drove a huge amount of business for Kroger. I remember, I think we did some analysis. It was something like a 9x return Kroger got on those investments and those personalized. But it went a lot beyond that. I mean, all of our pricing programs were using the data, meaning we understood which of the items we were selling were really important to our price sensitive customers. And so, we helped identify those items. I mean, we use them for deciding what items to take off the shelf, right? Because you found, interestingly, you often found that the items that normally, if you're taking an item off the shelf, say, well, what's my slowest seller? I'm just going to take that off the shelf. And what you found was sometimes the slowest sellers were actually bought exclusively by your loyal customers. And so you didn't want to take those off because you'd alienate your best customers. So it turned out some other product that sold more but was easily substitutable was the one you wanted to take off. And so it really wound up, playing a pretty big role across the whole business.
Yeah, that was before my time here. I came over. I was over the pond when you guys were partnered with them and driving most of that stuff. But yeah, they really innovated a lot of pioneering uses of data, and you mentioned some great examples there. And then turned a lot of those into software products later on, and were able to go to market from a SaaS perspective with those globally, but also work in some really big strategic transformations with retailers like Kroger, and I was fortunate enough to do that with the Co-op Group in the Nordics and lots of others as well. So it was a really unique kind of company and a unique range of products and services, and fascinating.
Any curious, any kind of big learnings or takeaways you took from your time there in terms of, how retailers run themselves or the value of the data? Anything that might be worth spending a few minutes on?
Well, I think Clive Humby used to say it all starts with the data. I think you have the sort of garbage in, garbage out version of that, but that same sentiment, I think that that was true then. I think that still applies now to even some of the emerging new artificial intelligence use cases and some of the agentic commerce, which will I'm sure we'll come on to talk about a little bit. But that I think as a principle still applies and was just so powerfully reinforced to me, and some in some good ways and some bad ways learned. If the data's not really clean, robust, organized, privacy compliant, if that foundation isn't in place, you're not going to achieve the value. And it's a real advantage, and it's a real kind of fundament enabler for a lot of retail activations. So I think that'd be the first thing. Like I said, dunnhumby does a range of different things. I always felt it did its best work when it was part of a big strategic transformation, and the role of engaging cross-functionally the C-suite in that, and having a plan and some real change management in place, really was obvious to me, like how big a difference that made between success and failure in some of those transformations. And dunnhumby achieved some fantastic results for customers when those things were in place and focused on, and other times it was more of just a focus on implementing a software or rolling out an approach, and that didn't quite have as much impact. So I think the importance of those things in driving big transformations was really reinforced to me. From a learning perspective, I think, having a focus and a constant focus on innovation and moving with speed. dunnhumby's a fantastic company and has innovated a lot in its early days, but then maybe took the focus off that and more into productizing and its offering. And, competitors catch up, and people, keep innovating and building new things. And if you don't, keep that up and really march forward, take that on, plant flags quickly, people will come and seize the territory. So I think that was a learning that I think is good advice, and good. I've applied to other roles and experiences since.
Yeah, it's definitely, the innovator dilemma is a real thing, right? You create the market, but then you kind of get established, and then you don't really innovate as much. Well, since we're talking about innovation, let's move on to the hot area. And I know one we've both been spending a lot of time in, but let's talk about AI, and particularly AI in retail, because I think there's a lot of talk, and I think everyone's spending a lot of time thinking about it. But curious, what are you seeing in terms of AI in retail? I mean, where do you, just generally, like how are retailers approaching it? Where do you think they're biggest opportunities, lay?
Yeah, no, I think mostly it's still early days. I think a lot of retailers are doing pilots, and I think the pilot purgatory is the phrase that's being used around the industry for that. So there's that side. I think there's a lot of work still on the internal foundations. So I think most retailers are in that space. They're putting something, I mentioned data, putting some of the foundations in place around data and capabilities and data platforms and doing lots of pilots. Most of those, from what I see, tend to be machine learning based functional activations for different functions, a marketing use case or a merchandising, for a particular capability or particular lever, a machine learning approach. Some operational in-store type solutions as well. So I think that's where most retailers are, but I think it's quite bifurcated. I think there's some larger, more advanced retailers who are, have announced, Walmart, of course, and Target have announced partnerships, and Instacart too with ChatGPT, OpenAI, and they're doing some advanced agentic commerce implementations. Other retailers are building their own AI assistants and piloting those and doing some more advanced AI use cases. But I'd say generally that's an exception. I think there's a few retailers doing that. There's a lot sort of monitoring how things are developing, how it's looking, piloting other things, building some foundations. I'd say it's still, despite the growth of the last couple of years, it's still pretty early days.
Yeah, I think you tend to be right. I do think this is one of those big bifurcations where you've got a very small number of big guys, within the grocery space, Walmart, maybe Kroger to a degree, but, who are investing heavily, really working on it. And then, a lot of people, I think, who are just trying to figure out where to go with it. I know we were both at an AI event, the Retail Club event back in September. And I will say one thing that struck me was, a lot of the retailers were there to listen. And so there was a lot less doing than thinking about and talking. And so I still think it is very early within it. One of the stats we got from that conference, and I think I've seen in a bunch of places, is something like 90% of all AI initiatives fail or are failing. And I'm curious, what do you think's driving that? Because it's a huge number, and you'd think with all the emphasis on AI, it wouldn't be quite that bad, but it seems to be the case. What do you think's behind that, or what are you seeing?
Well, I think part of it is what we were talking about, that it is early. So people are, piloting things and learning, and this is not fully baked solutions often that are being rolled out. So it is experimental to some degree. So that's part of it. I think part of it is that it's hard. This is maybe a more disruptive technology. It's evolving very fast. There's different, versions and things coming on all the time. So the pace of it is one aspect as well. And then, I guess circling back to the dunnhumby learnings, I think often AI is being approached as tactical pilots to solve a particular use case and not aligned with a strategy, not communicated to the business as such, maybe not accompanied by as much change management or engagement and bringing the organization along on what that means and how work will change for people in that scenario. So then if that doesn't happen, and at the same time the technology itself is evolving and changing and it's a bit uncertain what will come of it, so you really need a loop or an engine. You don't just need a one-off change management, before and after process. You need how are we going to evolve as this evolves, and how are we going to build a system and a culture and an approach that enables that ongoing change and that loop of learning and change. And I think that is very, very rare.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. I mean, I think it's like a lot of technology. It's almost easier to turn it on than to figure out how to use it, right? It's particularly with something like AI, it feels like you can use ChatGPT on your own. You could, now there's a lot of them get integrated regardless, right? So if you're using Google, there's Gemini. If you're a Microsoft shop, right, it's embedded with Copilot, and you almost can start using it right away. But how to use it and whether people are already trained on how to use it and how does it fit in the organization. And I'd say one thing I'm also seeing is a lot of stuff's very just disjointed right now. I think you mentioned how dunnhumby was strongest when there was like a whole plan. It was part of the big transformation. It seems to me there's just a lot of each organization or group within the company is kind of off doing its own thing. Like maybe their merchandising is using chat, Copilot in some way, or they have some app they've deployed or they're using, or IT's doing something else, and marketing is doing its own, and finance has done something, and they're all sort of out there, but they don't really connect, right? And they're not part of one plan. And I think they don't get the resourcing, they don't get the attention. I think it winds up being just kind of a cluster at the end.
Right. And how does it all fit together? And, how are you going to take the learnings from one into the next and so on and so forth? So, yeah, I mean, you and I have heard that a lot in our discussions with retailers recently on this topic. Yeah, right.
Yeah, no, for sure. Where do you think, I mean, let's go to change management first, and I want to circle back maybe to a few interesting use cases. But, I tend to agree. I mean, I know we both talked a lot, and, I think change management winds up being the real hard part, right? Because again, it can be kind of easy. It's almost easier to deploy something. Hey, we're going to automate this. We're going to throw an agent at that. We're going to give everyone access to, ChatGPT or Claude or whatever you're going to get, than it is to really get value out of it. I'm kind of curious, like, how do you, in your mind, like, how does a retailer need to approach it? What are some of the keys that go into that?
I'd say, think about it at two levels. Like, think about it from a strategy perspective. So, what is the purpose? And clarifying that with the organization. So, what is our strategy overall as an enterprise, as a retailer? What are we trying to achieve? And how does AI fit into that? How does it enable that? What is our vision for how AI will help us become a better retailer or a different retailer, and in what way? And what do we believe about AI? What is our way of thinking about it? What are our goals for it? And can you make any commitments to the organization around that, in terms of what you're trying to achieve with it and how you'll use it? So I think that starting with that purpose, the why behind the AI is the line we've been using. But starting with that purpose for the AI strategy, then getting into the method. How are we going to use it? How are we going to become a learning organization based around it? What use cases are we going to prioritize? How are we going to govern those? How are we going to measure and learn and so on? So that's, I think, the second part. And then third, I'd say the means. What are we going to give access to who? How are we going to coach folks on that? The data foundations, the tech foundations, the training. So that's all. So I bundle all those three areas together in the strategy. Having a strategy for AI. And then if you think about so that's one side of it. And then if you think about the change management activation side, how do you look at your processes and say, okay, what do we actually, and often those are not well mapped. The before isn't well mapped, let alone the after. So what is our process today? What are the different tasks that go into that? And then when we, use AI in whatever guise that may be to into that process, how does that change the tasks, the functions around that, and where does that push the roadblocks? Because typically what happens, and I think this is true with any technology, you move the constraints. AI will resolve the constraint of, we don't have 10 people to do this manual part of the process, so we haven't been doing it very well, or we've been skipping it, or we've been using something else. Okay, now AI can do that. That's going to move the constraint away from that part to a different part. And how do you identify that and then change people's roles and functions around it? So I think the whole process and workflow, that then leads into roles and responsibilities. Okay, I was doing these tasks, now I'm doing those tasks. What does that mean for my role, my responsibilities? And how do you build that into a learning loop? Because it will change. And how do you measure what's changing, what people are doing differently, how they're adopting it, and kind of feed that back in? So it's easy to, it's kind of the unsexy stuff, I guess. It's hard, it's easy to bypass that and just focus on, we've got this, amazing new technology and this new solution and how clever this is, it can do that. But how does everything change around it? What's the second order, third order impacts of those that we need to understand, to measure, understand, and then loop around? Because like I said, things will, and we've seen this, things will move around. The constraints will move. It will create, other work and blockers elsewhere, than that you then apply something else to move that. So it's thinking about it more as a process. So yeah, hopefully that answers.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. Yeah, it seems to me like, I totally agree with you. It's always a challenge when you think. One thing I worry about with retail is retail in technology has always been heavy on customization, right? It's always like, hey, I've got your nice software is great, but I want to heavily customize it. And in some ways, the fear is that AI makes it easy to do that. Like I can automate my horrible process really well with an agent. And I think you're right. And new technology always takes time for people to say. I think the first move for a lot of people is make our current process a bit more efficient. And I think it takes time for people to say, you know what, we could do this totally differently. We don't have to do it this way. We can actually come up with a new process that's much better than the old way of doing it. And I don't think it's bad to start with automating the current way because it's easy and I think it's obvious to people. But I do worry that we're just going to embed some of the, the kind of bad ways we've created that just work with our process, but maybe not be the best way of doing things.
Right. Yeah. So I think you think about it as objectives, like what are the inputs and the outputs, and there might be multiple steps in the current process, but AI can, in some cases will replace just one of the existing manual or SaaS steps. In other cases, it's going to replace 5 or 6 or 7 different areas, and that's a big change. And that's what I'm saying about, okay, well that changes redesigns the whole workflow and the whole process and moves a constraint somewhere else that you then need to rethink. So it's a sort of iterative, deep thing, and I think that's you're absolutely right to call that out. I think that's another risk we probably should have highlighted earlier in terms of where AI is today. Is a lot of folks just thinking about it as an automation. How do I do this faster? How do I do this cheaper with less human intervention? Rather than thinking, what could this capability? I think that's a wider point about AI. People relate it always to human terms, when we will have general, intelligence from AI, whereas actually that's not really the best way to think about it. It's not necessarily about replacing human intelligence or human work. It's about how can we get a result? How can we get an output into our workflows in the best way possible, and rethinking it that way. But that's a bigger, more difficult exercise than replacing what we have and putting a widget in.
Yeah, no, for sure. One thing I want to come back to because I think one of us when we were both talking about AI early, and one of the things I think struck both of us is in some ways the similarities back to maybe 15, 20 years ago when the just beginning to work on customer data. And I this is one of my big things I learned or saw at Kroger, right? Which is it was still fairly new using the work with dunnhumby and managing the customer data. And it was the reason it worked at Kroger was because there was a focus on change management, right? And the idea was, right, starting with Dave Dillon, who is the CEO and the senior team, it was a focus on like, we are going to do things differently, right? And so when you come to me with your merchandising plan, for example, you need to show me all the customer data, right? And initially it was problematic or at least a burden because we effectively hadn't taken any work off the merchant's plate. It was just like, here's more stuff now you've got to do. And so I think there was really a multi-year effort of how do we make this more efficient, right? How do we get everybody on board, training, support, other things so that the merchants, when they were coming up with plans, now it was easier, right? This data helped them and streamlined things and gave them new ways of thinking about their job, not just like, oh God, here's one more dump of things I've got to do before I can be done with my merchandising plan. And I see a lot of similarities here, right? One, I know you talked about earlier, which is it's got to be led from the top in the senior team, right? It can't just be some ground up initiative. It's got to be a consistent plan across the company. And it's got to, really think about how do I bring everyone along so that we're making everyone's lives easier.
Yeah, I think that gets back to what I was saying around the purpose aspect of the strategy, right? So I wasn't close to the Kroger work at the time, but from what I saw and heard of it, the senior leadership team at Kroger did a fantastic job of articulating how this was part of their strategy, how you're going to be more focused on customers using data, and what meant by that, and what was involved in that, how that was going to happen, why that was going to happen. So I think it started with that. I think that's an important part of it. And then, different techniques to kind of embed that through the organization. I think you have the customer keys or the customer promises is one example. Tesco in the UK had a similar approach. And so they could articulate why they were using data to improve how they were using data to improve experiences for customers and why we were focusing on that and putting results against it. And I worked in Norway. We had the Viking laws of how we were approaching price and promotions using data to get a better result for customers. So just little ways to codify or bring charters or I guess commitments of this is what this means in this context, and this is what we want, how we want things to be done, and how we want you to use this to and why to drive that result. So I think that's a big part of it. And it's in some ways it's a cultural change, right? These big transformations, many years there's language aspects to it, and how different terminology, how you refer to things, how you talk about things. So there's all that, and how you communicate with people along that journey to make sure they're aware of what's going on, how they're part of it, being brought along. You can gamify people's interactions with it and have customer champions. I think is another technique that we saw on both sides of the pond around that, which I know some retailers are bringing that on board in terms of AI champions and different teams across the organization. So a lot of different techniques and tactics you can use there to help with that.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think the other part, the one last thing I'll say on change management, I think it fits into everything you said, is I do think there's a lot of uncertainty and fear around employees, right? Anytime you get these new technologies, it's what does it mean for me? What does it mean for my job? And the last thing you want is the team rejecting something because they're all sitting there worried, well, if I automate this, I'm going to be out of a job, right? And I think making it clear how it's going to be used. And look, we should be realistic. Some jobs will go away, right? Because if there's a person whose full job is, aggregating the data from 10 systems to create a Monday morning report, that may be automated, but what can that person now go do and get trained to do? And I think helping people understand how the organization is going to evolve, I think is an important part of that, because otherwise you're just going to get a ton of grassroots resistance that's just going to make everything harder.
Yeah, it's definitely more human sensitive technology transformation than some of the other previous ones. So I totally get that. I mentioned earlier, codifying, putting a charter of what AI means for the organization. I've read some organizations making commitments to their people around that to say, hey, we're not, maybe this is not, realistic for a lot of organizations, but I think some have made commitments to say, we're not going to reduce headcount as a result of this, or we're just going to, there'll be no net new headcount reductions, or making some commitments. Maybe that's too far for some organizations, but what can you commit to reassure people around how they're going to use this and what this will mean for them, and how they should think about it in an empowering way. I think that there are ways to help with that, but of course that human sensitive piece, it's not just job reductions, it's also just trust and transparency and confidence in the technology. And some people do a zero-shot prompt on a personal matter to OpenAI and get back a bad response, and then Gen AI isn't very good.
Right.
Is the outcome of that. So there's all kinds of things to be addressed in the communications and the planning to help with that as well.
Yeah, no, agreed. Let's talk a little bit about the technology side just for a second. I know we talked about it. That's easier than the change management side, but it's still a thing. I know we talked about, the Walmarts of the world, right? Clearly investing heavily, Amazon's in this technology. But if I'm a mid-market retailer, what can I realistically accomplish internally? And then how do I think about finding partners, right? Because there's certainly a lot of companies building out AI solutions, whether it's a broad-based platform or it's very specific to a use case, an in-store use case, an online e-commerce, marketing, merchandise, whatever. How would you think about that if you're maybe not a smaller retailer, right? Somebody who doesn't have, the wherewithal to hire up a huge AI team.
Right. Yeah. No, I think definitely kind of hiring your way to AI maturity is not feasible for a lot of mid-market and other retailers. So I think that would be difficult. So I would say, do have a small core of an in-house team that can really own it, and then have multiple partners to support you. I think the strategy and product management should be internally driven. There definitely needs to be an internal, champion, but also someone who's day-to-day delivering those things. So I think that's really key, and the data. So I would have, strategy, data, and product management internally driven. And then I would look for partners in other spaces. I would think about, capability partners rather than function or feature vendors. So I think it's a little different. And this is, one of the things that's holding AI back at the moment a little bit is repackaging digital transformation or SaaS deployments and trying to treat AI like that. So I would take a little bit of a different approach, looking for partners that are able to learn, able to grow with you, able to pilot, more flexible, can prove value. I would not get locked in with big long-term vendor relationships. I'd certainly avoid lock-in with the big LLMs, and I wouldn't put anything, which is tempting for some retailers, given the constraints around and then the concerns around security and trust. And you mentioned Copilot, and a lot of retailers, I work with this cloud provider or I work with this house, so we'll just do everything there. I don't think you want to be reliant on one. I think all these models will equal out at some point, and you will end up, in a multi-model strategy, like, often they are on a multi-cloud strategy. So I would not avoid lock-in at that level as well, at the vendor level. And look for partners who, are flexible and can learn with you and can support you and bring capabilities, not functions and features.
Yeah, no, I think that's really great advice. Yeah, I mean, I tend to agree on the. I've been a long-term fan of, retailers, doing more with startups and with innovative companies. I think my feeling has been retailers tend to, for good reason, want to work with either their established partners or larger players. We all know retail is an operationally intense business. The last thing you need is going live with something and it collapses or can't support your scale. That said, I do think this is an area being a little more forward, a little more willing to check out stuff. And when I say that, it's, I think there's a process of really meeting people, finding the companies and the teams that are a good fit with you as a company, right? They've got the right mindset, they have the right vision, it's a good fit with yours, because there's endless number of companies jumping in at AI. And at some point, part of the problem for retailers is you've just got this swarm of people all telling you they do the same thing in the same way, and you should work with them, not that other guy. But there are ways of, I think, you meet enough with them, you start quickly understanding who has the goods, who doesn't. Again, on the team level, who seems to be a good fit with the way we want to work, who's willing to work with us in the right way, and then start piloting. Because again, I agree with you, you don't want lock-in. The last thing you want is, I just signed up with these guys and that it's like an all or nothing thing. That's a terrible way of going forward. You're going to wind up getting stuck in the end. But I do think having a sort of a set of vendors you can rely on, you test with, you figure out the ones that really click with you, and then scale up from there. And whether that's from just meeting them at industry events, I know we have NRF coming up, or whether it's asking peers and others, but looking at who's getting funded by which VCs. I think all those are part of a process. Certainly, I think we place some value with our client about bringing in who do we think are the guys you should be talking to if hey, I'm looking for something in store, I'm looking for something to help me with with marketing. I think finding those trusted advisors, I think, is another way of going. But I do think it's important to be more open to maybe some of the more earlier stage companies, particularly around AI.
Totally agree. Yeah, I think startups have a really important role to play. I think it's very tempting to, who's the biggest, who do most retailers use in this space, and just jump in with them. I think it's too early to take that approach with AI, and you probably will miss a partner who is a better fit for you just because they happen to have, been there earlier or signed a few more retailers at that point. So I definitely think you need to take some risks in that regard and not always just go with the incumbent in the space. I just add, Ken, I think having a mindful, like piloting for sure, but going back to our previous conversation, having a mindful plan of what use cases we're piloting and how we're going to evolve from those and how it connects across things, not just doing the pilot purgatory piece that we mentioned.
I know, absolutely, couldn't agree more. Let's just spend a few minutes on agentic commerce. Right, that's been probably the hottest topic in retail, right? And that covers everything from consumers going to ChatGPT and asking for things. Increasingly now, I know you've written about it. How some of the Instacarts and Walmarts and others are beginning to test being able to purchase directly through some of these LLMs. So curious, where do you see that going? And if you're again kind of focusing more on the mid-sized grocer, how would you be approaching agentic commerce?
Well, I know we're slightly, I'm slightly more in the camp of, worry and do something now than you are on this topic. I know you see the consumer adoption on these sort of things being a bit slower than maybe I think about it. So there's a scale, I guess. There's your sort of Luddite deniers on one hand of the scale, and your maximalists, and this is going to take over the world of retail tomorrow on the other side. And I'm probably slightly more towards the latter than you, but I definitely, I don't think it's existential risk or concern right now, but I do believe it's really going to be a really important new growth driver. And I think if you look at where retail is growing and where incremental growth is going to come from, and I think there's often been debates around in-store versus e-commerce and digital, and in-store is still 90% of transactions, but doesn't necessarily get that much focus for things like retail media investment. But the point is, where is the new growth coming from? Where is the real incremental growth coming from? That has been from digital, from e-commerce, and that's I think why it's benefited from more. One of the reasons it's benefited from more investment in retail media revenue, for example. So I think that similar for agentic commerce, that's a lot of new growth is going. I think there's a projection it's going to be 1.5% to 2% of growing the pie, right? So if you think about it as there are some customers who will be attracted to retailers that haven't shopped at a retailer before. AI will bring new customers to some retailers, and it will create new solutions. It won't just be customers buying what they've always bought. They will find a new use case or a new solution. So if it's going to be new customers and new solutions, that's going to be net new growth. That's estimated at 1.5% to 2% of the total retail industry. That's how much the pie will grow. So I think that's I think by 2030 was that statistic. So if that's going to happen, retailers need to benefit and need to realize part of that growth. It's not going to replace everything else. It's not going to replace the e-commerce and on-site activations, or of course in store, especially not for grocery in certain categories which naturally trend themselves to that. But I think it's going to be material enough that you can say, me as if I put myself in the shoes of a mid-market retailer, I need to be involved. I need to be in that. If you look at Black Friday, Cyber Monday, I think that AI-driven traffic was up 800%. I think the full holiday period numbers aren't out yet, but trending around 700% growth. So, there's a lot more traffic coming in a different way. It is going to be material. So I think retailers have to get involved and think about it, and start testing how that works on their own, how agentic commerce works on their own properties, exploring partnerships with some of these AI models. It's going to make, and the flip side is it's not going to disrupt the whole path to purchase that exists today, but it's another complication to it. It's another level. It's people will use your stores and your own properties, and also these AI assisted paths to purchase. So it just explodes the complexity. It will change how customers shop. It will change their expectations for e-commerce on retailers' own sites. So I think the sooner retailers are preparing for that from a data perspective, from understanding what these new signals of data are that are being captured by AI systems, as soon as you start understanding that, preparing for that, and learning how this is working, the better. It's not going to replace everything overnight, but it's going to be material. And I definitely think having there's big implications, I think, for the data side, for the retail media, other monetization aspects, as well as the customers' path to purchase. So I'm big on it, and I think it's disruptive and important, and needs to get involved with sooner rather than later.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you on that. Yeah, my thing is this: I think from a search point of view, I think it's a huge disruptor earlier, in the sense that I do think already, I've been doing it. Go on when you have a question, go to ChatGPT, and ask, hey, I have to set up a dinner party for this coming weekend. What should I make? And then, you get recommendations, and it's a much better experience than hunting and pecking around recipe sites and doing this. And I've used it for other things like running shoes and things. So I could see that pretty quickly adopting, because to me, it's not as huge change of behavior for consumers, right? From a consumer point of view, right? It's just a lot better way of finding what I want, which is what I've been using search for the last, 20 years. But now instead I can actually ask it a question and get a much richer set of answers back, and whether that's recipes or it could even be, hey, here's my shopping list week. Where can I find this the cheapest, right? And I think at that level, it could be a big thing. And I think for retailers, you want to make sure you're showing up in those searches, right? Or brands as well. And if somebody's on ChatGPT figuring out, hey, where's the best place to go buy all these things I need for my holiday party, you better be showing up. And my quick just pucking around is, not every retailer you expect to see come up in these searches come up. And so for me, like, understanding what drives what people are looking for, and then making sure your data is set up. Do I have rich product definitions? Am I plugged in to the LLMs in a way that they can capture my data and find it? I think those are all critical to do now, not a year from now or 2 years from now. And I agree with you too. And what are you doing on your own site to make that a better shopping experience and keep people in your orbit by providing, again, richer search capabilities, better recommendations, all those things. So to me, that's where I think I think eventually will people say, hey, here's my grocery list, go ahead and buy it for me. I think eventually we'll get there. I think that will just take a bit longer, but to me, that's a bigger change in behavior of trusting this thing to go off and find me the right items and coordinate the deliveries and all that stuff. But we'll get there, but I think that'll be a little slower to develop.
Yeah. No, I think that's fair. Yeah. I think it's a really important area. I think it's going to grow quicker than we expect. I mean, it did take a while for e-commerce adoption, particularly for some categories like we talked about for grocery to get significant. I think that did take some time, but also we have the hardware now, right? I mean, we have one of the blockers. I remember back in the day for e-commerce was, not all customers have smartphones, not all customers have this, and they won't engage with coupons or whatever digital activation it was because of that reason. Well, pretty much everyone has a phone at this point, right? So some of those. So I think generally we're more digitally advanced. That some of the roadblocks, some of the kind of hardware infrastructure pieces on the customer side are fixed. I'm sure there'll be more, virtual reality, all the rest of it come in. But I think some of the things that held back maybe the digital e-commerce growth are resolved now. So that will help this grow maybe a bit quicker than some people expect. I think the on-site way is a really good starting point for retailers to start to capture this data from themselves, because I'm not sure all the ins and outs with some of the integrations. I'm sure Walmart and Target negotiated the good data sharing piece with the LLMs that they've integrated with the AI assistants they've integrated with. But no better substitute than having an agent on your own website, where you then in firsthand will capture those queries and those prompts of what customers are asking it for, and are they having a dinner party, and whose birthday is it, and what are all those preferences. And those are really rich data signals, which if you have your own on-site agent, you may not capture as much of them as ChatGPT will, but you'll at least capture a few and start to understand what those look like and how you can use them and so on. So I think that's
Yeah, no, I mean, I think all this has huge potential to fill in a big gap. Like, again, stick to grocery just for a second, because I think it's products everyone knows, right? I can know what you buy. You buy Tides, you buy Cheerios, you buy apples, whatever it is you're buying. But I don't have a lot of a sense of your intent. I can infer it a little bit, like, well, maybe you're on a certain diet. If I see you buying keto-related items, I'm going to know that. But imagine all the rich data you're going to get when people tell you, hey, I'm planning a party this weekend, or I'm going on a trip, or I've decided I need to lose weight for the new year as my resolution to lose weight, or I've just started Ozempic, and what kind of changes should I be making? That's a huge and rich set that most businesses don't have today. They're going to now be able to tap, and I think they better figure out a way to tap that data. The alternate challenge is the chat GPTs of the world are going to be getting that data as well. And now you're in a situation where, the retailer doesn't exclusively own their insights into the customer, which is going to be itself a pretty big change, for some of these players, particularly the bigger ones. Cool. Well, last quick question. I know we're running out of time and I want to kind of wrap up, but just maybe at a personal level, I know you spend a lot of time thinking about AI. I'm curious, like, what are a couple of tools you use in your day-to-day life, whether it's for business or personal, that you particularly like, maybe for the audience?
Well, I'm quite into it. So I studied, I did a course at UC Berkeley 3 years ago, and that was my kind of introduction into the space. So I use ChatGPT for all kinds of, writing and information gathering. So that's my kind of go-to model. I use Claude for some, very basic coding and agentic workflows that I built for myself around my business and processing things and helping me build things. And I think Google Gemini 3, is it, or 3 Pro now, the latest version that came out a couple of months ago now, really a huge step forward. And I run my business on the Google Mail and Google platform. So I use that for particularly for image generated stuff. And Nano Banana is fantastic if you haven't used that for developing imagery and infographics, and that's real fantastic solution. So I found that for slide materials. Gemini into Google Slides has really helped save me time and improve my productivity. So those will be my three picks. But ChatGPT is my go-to day to day for all kinds of travel planning and itineraries and planning shopping. And I've used all the digital agentic commerce integrations, of course, tested those all out. So Instacart's my pick on that one so far, but they're all
awesome,
evolving rapidly.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I've sort of adopted ChatGPT, and I usually use it mostly if I feel like I need to pick me up in the day, because it's always so flattering of how good my questions are. Hey, great question, Ken. I'm going to let me answer that one for you. So,
I mean, my pro tip would be on the the personalization settings in ChatGPT. You can go in and say, don't be. I think there's some preset options you can choose, but you can. I have told it, just don't be overly agreeable and flatter me. Just give it to me.
I think I changed mine too. I believe I changed it. I think you can go to like sarcasm mode, which I think is pretty hilarious in the end.
I might try that. So that's a tip. If you don't like being too buttered up by ChatGPT, you can have it turn that off. And there's an about me section in there, so you can you can ask your AI assistant, write a best practice about me section for my AI assistants so that the outputs are more relevant to me, and it will write that for you, and you can then paste that in there. And I found, that just putting that in that section really, improved the quality of the relevance of the outputs it was giving me, just as a simple little hack pro tip from me there, Ken.
That's great. Well, thank you very much. Hey, Grant, it's been a great conversation. If people want to get in touch with you to talk about AI or other topics, what's the best way to do that?
Yes, I guess LinkedIn. I'm often on there, linkedin.com/Grant Steadman, and we're at Astroworks, astroworks.ai. So please reach out and we'll be in touch.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate your time and look forward to continuing the conversation. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Ken. Good to talk. Keep well.